Hello and welcome to my channel, I Want to Lose Gaming. It's time for an ultimate Lauma guide where you'll learn everything you need to know about llamas. This guide is comically long, so we're keeping this intro shorter than Xiao because Lauma is a comically complicated character. Lauma is the ultimate Bloom sub-DPS support character who blooms Bloom back into the meta. Lauma will also likely be a Laumazing support for future Lunar-Bloom characters. This video was filmed on the early access server and is not indicative of the final product. There may be some changes on release, so be sure to check the comments down below to see if there are any. As always though, we'll go through her kit, artifacts and stats, weapons, constellations and investment priority, teams, and finally, my opinion at the end of the video. Okay, you guys have got to see her basic attacks, and we're of course going to bring this to our good old Regisfine friend. And look at that! Lunar blooms! It looks so weird. Lauma's normal attacks appear to have standard ICD, and with how reasonably frequently she attacks at around normals 1 through 3, taking about 1.75 seconds or so. On many teams, it is worth to on-field her in order to apply a lot more Dendro as well as to trigger spread. But a bit more testing might be needed to confirm if these are standard ICD or not. As for her charge attacks, they are a bit awkward to use because you need to first use her deer form and then cancel it, preferably with a basic attack button input, after which you can use a few charged attacks during deer form's cooldown. In my opinion, not really worth the stamina consumption, but hey. Now, before we move on to the actually important parts of her kit, we need to learn a bit about some new Nod-Krai mechanics such as Verdant Dews and Lunar-Bloom. Lauma converts the Bloom reaction to the Lunar-Bloom reaction, and despite the strange italicized gradient fill trademark pending Lunar-Bloom text appearing, these blooms created via the Lunar-Bloom reaction all have the same properties as a normal bloom and still just do regular bloom damage. And yes, that includes other blooms like Hyper Bloom and Burgeon as well. The main difference with these lunar blooms is that you'll generate a Verdant Dew, or one of these moon things, which fills up one every 2.5 seconds. You can hold up to 3 of these Verdant Dews, and certain characters can use these Verdant Dews in one way or another. But wait, that's not all. We'll very briefly have to talk about Moonsign as well, another new Nod-Krai mechanic. As of 6.0's release, there are 3 characters with a passive that provides 1 Moonsign level. These characters, being from Nod-Krai, are Lauma, Aino, and Anefa. So with one of these characters in your party or 1 Moonsign level, you get Nascent Gleam, and with 2 Moonsign characters in your party, you get Ascendant Gleam, and Nascent Gleam is still active as well. Various artifacts, weapons, and characters have effects based on whether or not you have Nascent and or Ascendant Gleam. Finally, non-Moonsign characters also provide a buff to lunar reactions if you have Ascendant Gleam. Phew! Okay, now that you know what Verdant Dews are and Moonsign are, let's take a look at her elemental skill. Frankly, her elemental skill does, well, way too much stuff, but upon using her elemental skill, it summons a Frost Grove Sanctuary, aka this deer thing that attacks nearby enemies once every 2 seconds, and applies 1 gauge of Dendro on each attack. Now, the raw Dendro damage that her skill does isn't fantastic, but it scales off of attack and elemental mastery. More importantly, it shreds enemies' Dendro and Hydro resistances. 25% resistance shred at talent level 10, and yes, this is pretty much most of Nilo's Constellation 2 built into her base kit. But what makes this deer feel particularly Laumazing is that it follows Lauma and has perfect radial AoE, consistently applying Dendro around her and freeing her from circle impact. And now, well, we can talk about how her skill utilizes the Verdant Dews that I was yapping about earlier through her hold elemental skill. By simply holding the elemental skill button, Lauma gobbles up any whole Verdant dues, and for each whole Verdant due that she gobbled up, she'll deal this amount of elemental mastery scaling Lunar-Bloom damage. Yes, this is the first and only way to deal actual Lunar-Bloom damage, and this thing can crit and ignores the defense multiplier, thus leading to some potentially remarkable damage number. Now, using Lauma's elemental skill will also provide the following buffs thanks to her passive, where if you have Nascent Gleam, aka if you just have Lauma on the team, Bloom, Hyper Bloom, and Burgeon damage can now crit with a 15% chance to crit and 100% crit damage. Yeah, this is basically Nahida's Constellation 2 built into Lauma's base kit. Alternatively, if you have Lauma plus another Nod-Krai character like Aino on the team, you'll now reach Ascendant Gleam, and then Lunar-Bloom damage's crit rate will increase by 10% and crit damage by 20%. It is very important to note that you cannot have both of these buffs active at the same time. Now, generally speaking, as of Lauma's release, Lauma tends to prefer to be the only Nod-Krai Moonsign character on the team to stay at Nascent Gleam to give all the blooms in her party the 15% chance to crit, since the only way to deal any Lunar-Bloom damage at the moment is only through her hold elemental skill, which, while it does do decent damage, is not typically going to be the main source of damage for your team. In the future though, if we get a Lunar-Bloom DPS character, then Ascendant Gleam's 40% crit value could prove to be the preferred buff. So yeah, as you can see, Lauma's skill is ridiculously cracked and does way too much. But we're just getting started, because Lauma's burst is also La Marvelous. And this thing provides Pale Hymn stacks, which are basically bloom-related Shenhe quills, and at talent level 9, each Pale Hymn provides 472.2% elemental mastery as flat bloom damage. In this example, we can see with Lauma having 1102 elemental mastery, the Pale Hymns made the bloom deal 4,258 more damage. In this next clip, Hyper Bloom also did 4,258 more damage, despite, well, Hyper Bloom and the baseline dealing much more damage. Now, how many Pale Hymn stacks does she get? Upon casting her burst, by default it provides 18 stacks, and to keep it simple, based on how many Verdant dues you consume through her whole skill, either before or even after her burst, each Verdant due consumed provides 6 more Pale Hymn stacks, for up to 18 additional Pale Hymn stacks. So to put it even more simply, basically for most rotations you'll have 30 to 36 Pale Hymns. And let's say with around 1,200 combat elemental mastery at talent level 10, Lauma basically provides around 216,000 flat bloom damage, which is why her elemental burst is a rather important and powerful part of her kit. Her burst also provides a bit smaller of a flat damage buff to Lunar Bloom damage as well, but as of her release, only one hit from Lauma every 12 seconds can take advantage of that and deals actual Lunar Bloom damage. So as of her release right now, this part isn't too relevant, but I'm sure it will be relevant in the future. Finally, hitting 2 enemies will consume 2 Pale Hymn stacks, so these stacks are consumed much more quickly in AoE situations. Let's take a quick look at the actual damage formula for the flat bloom as well as the lunar flat bloom damage that Lauma's elemental burst adds. Now, starting off, we have the usual elemental mastery scaling portion called EM bonus in this case, which is where on their stat page in the EM side you can see that it increases, bloom, hyper bloom, and burgeon damage by this number right here. It's these percentages right here. Then we actually have the base damage of the bloom. This would be how much the bloom would do if your character is at level 90, and then after that we take this damage number here, and we're going to be using bloom as an example. Now, typically what would happen is that you would actually multiply it by the resistance as well as the bloom crit, but because of Lauma's flat damage, the formula changes a little bit here. However, we actually add it right here to the bloom base damage. So what this means is that the flat bloom damage here does not get multiplied by EM bonus as well as bloom bonus, and instead it is added onto this portion of the formula after which you multiply by the enemy's resistance, and then you see if the bloom itself crit. And just to make sure it is clear, this is not your character's crit stats. This is based on, for example, Lauma's 15% from the Nascent Gleam buff, as well as Nahida's Constellation 2. Now, let's actually take a look at the Lunar-Bloom flat damage formula, and as well as, I guess, the Lunar-Bloom damage formula as well. We can see the EM bonus here, the scaling here is not quite as high as just, Bloom, for example. We can see here that indeed Lunar Charged and Lunar Bloom damage is increased by 146.7 instead of 391.1. And now we just take that multiplier, which in Lauma's case, it uses her Elemental Mastery stat, and then we multiply it by the multiplier presented in, her kit. Then we multiply this by Lauma's passive 3, which adds 14% to the Lunar Bloom multiplier. And then finally, we add the EM bonus plus Lunar Bloom bonus damage numbers here. For example, the 4-piece Silken Songs adds 10%, Ascendant Gleam adds some based on your non-Moonsign characters, etc, etc. And this is actually unlike regular flat damage, like for example Shenhe's Quills, which do get multiplied by the bonus damage multiplier, which, in this case, the EM bonus multiplier is basically taking its place. So instead, Lunar Bloom flat does not get multiplied by Lauma's passive 3, nor does it get multiplied by EM bonuses as well as Lunar Bloom bonuses. It is a flat damage after this part. Then we multiply it by crit, which is actually based on your character's crit stats for Lunar Bloom specifically. And then we have resistance. And finally, also notice that this is missing the defense multiplier. So the enemy's defense stat is not factored in here, which is why, of course, defense shredders and stuff are going to be useless with Lunar Bloom type damage. Now, let's take a look at just how much Lauma buffs Bloom damage using both her Elemental Skill and Elemental Burst to buff Hyper Bloom damage. Now, Hyper Bloom is, on average, hitting for 42,804 damage after factoring in Hyper Bloom crits. This is around 62% more damage than a standard Hyper Bloom. As we can see, Lauma is a massive buff to Bloom playstyles. Then, if we slap on her signature weapon, the Night Weaver's Looking Glass, now each Hyper Bloom is doing around 48,111 damage on average. Another notable improvement, although as a percentage is not as crazy as you might have expected. This massive increase to Bloom related damage is unsurprising, as her kit provides the following. She provides off-field 1 gauge Dendro application every 2 seconds in a radius around her. She provides 25% Dendro and Hydro resistance shred. Of course, all this stuff is at Constellation 0. And she provides roughly around 216,000 or so, a bit more, a bit less, flat Bloom damage for most free-to-play players. She provides 1 stack of Moonsign, and she has a passive that increases Lunar Bloom multiplier by 14%. Then the Nascent Gleam buff provides 15% crit rate and 100% crit damage for Bloom, Hyper Bloom, and Burgeon type damage, or the Ascendant Gleam buff provides 10% crit rate and 20% crit damage for Lunar Bloom damage. Finally, because she enables Nascent and Ascendant Gleam, this will help you provide the Silken Moon's Serenade buff, which is either 60 or 120 Elemental Mastery, and finally she can provide relevant Catalyst weapon buffs. Alright, and we've got a couple quick passives to rattle through, which I just kind of mentioned one, but the first one is that Lauma existing on the team with a certain amount of Elemental Mastery basically increases Lunar Bloom multipliers by 14%. Then we have another passive which increases Deer-related activity, such as increasing her Elemental Skill's Deer attack damage and shortening her Deer form cooldown, our dearest passive of all time. For talent priority, level up her skill and burst, and you don't really have to worry about leveling her basics. Lauma's kit is very complicated, but fortunately using her is fairly simple. As a wise philosopher once said, "Start a fight. Less than 3 moon things, tap E. 3 moon things, hold E. Use Q when possible." With most Bloom teams having flexible rotations, you can of course swap her back on after her 12-second cooldown on her skill to perform her hold E. But on more fixed rotations like with Alhaitham, just use hold E and Q from the second rotation onward. Alright, we've made it to the math section of this video, and I'm going to be completely honest, the math for Bloom teams is very chaotic and hectic, so I would generally view this as kind of a set of guidelines and advice over, more concrete math. that, for example, a more simple DPS character like Flynn's or Inefa might enjoy. With that being said, Lauma actually does have a decent amount of flexibility when it comes to her artifact sets. And we're going to start off with the 4-piece Silken Moon Serenade, which is a pretty good set for her. And regardless of whether she's the only Moonsign character on the team or not, you should have someone on her teams, typically for most of her teams, equip this. Not all of them, but most of them, especially the ones that are Bloom related teams. Someone on the team should be using it, and Lauma can be the character to use it, and she's a pretty good wielder of it as well. The 20% energy recharge is nice on her. This way, for most weapons and most setups, you can get away with an EM timepiece, EM goblet, and EM circlet, as well as, maybe like roughly 7-ish or so energy recharge substat rolls can handle her energy requirements for most teams. Alternatively, if you find yourself not having enough energy recharge, you can indeed use an energy recharge timepiece. However, that tends to be a bit overkill for most double Dendro teams that you'll run Lauma on, or on-field Lauma, which is also a common scenario for as of her release. But, with certain weapons and in certain situations, like for example, Stygian Onslaught, if you want her burst to be up quicker, an energy recharge timepiece might indeed be the way to go. The next setup to run on her to consider is a crit rate circlet, and she does definitely benefit from crit stats because of her hold elemental skill, dealing a pretty decent amount of her damage output, as well as if you on-field her, especially with Hyper Bloom. If you on-field Lauma with Hyper Bloom, then crit circlets become even more powerful because she will be activating spreads. So yeah, this is an even better setup on spread teams, although of course you can just always run EM, which covers essentially all of her teams. Now, up next we have a Dendro Goblet. Simply put, this is not recommended. Her scaling off of Dendro is very, very abysmal. Next best set, I would say, is the Deep Wood Memories, and in some situations it is the best set. And you can also run EM or EM on the Deepwood Memories, all of which are perfectly viable. Now, this is where, I was talking about, okay, which set should you prefer? Should you prefer the 4-piece Silken Moons or the 4-piece Deepwood Memories? Now, personally, I prefer, and I'm planning to run the 4-piece Silken Moon Serenade most of the time on Lauma. Of course, you can adjust it to the 4-piece Deepwood Memories. And this is simulating, okay, what if someone else is using the Deepwood on the team? Then you'll notice that Lauma does deal a little bit more damage. And meanwhile, if someone else is using the Silken Moons, not only do you have to get a ton of ER rolls in order to, kind of make up for the amount of ER rolls that's missing because of this, I personally will prefer using the 4-piece Silken Moons over the 4-piece Deepwoods on Lauma. A bit convoluted, but either way you can see that the difference between the two is going to be pretty small. Most of you guys are likely also going to have a better Deepwood Memory set for now, which you should just slap onto Lauma while you're farming for the 4-piece Silken Moons. Alternatively, you also have, for example, the 4-piece Gilded Dreams, which provides more elemental mastery than, either the Silken Moons or the Deepwood Memories. And what's interesting about this is that while theoretically this should increase Lauma's damage by the most out of all the sets, if a teammate is using the 4-piece Silken Moons and if a teammate is using the 4-piece Deepwood Memories, personally I find it to be surprisingly not that many teams that can really take advantage of this setup, but there are a few. So if you find yourself wanting to squeeze out every last little percentage points of damage out of Lauma, you can consider using, a more pure EM setup. And similarly, you can also run the 4-piece Flower of Paradise Lost. Generally speaking, though, if the enemy has a ton of Hydro on it, then, either you're over Hydroing the enemy, or you're fighting something like the Hydrotulpa, where you can create additional blooms. And also keep in mind that Hyper Blooms, for example, don't even benefit from this because, yeah, it's the Hyper Bloom trigger that will benefit from this, but you also gain a tiny bit of Lunar-Bloom damage as well. So yeah, it's a usable set. If you have a really good set with, like, crit substats, energy recharge, elemental mastery substat rolls, then yeah, you can consider using this as well in comparison to some of these other purely stat-stick options. But for most people, I recommend 4-piece Silken Moons and 4-piece Deepwood Memories on Lauma. Now, I did very briefly want to talk about Ascendant Gleam Lauma. The previous example was all with Nascent Gleam. So with Ascendant Gleam, her personal damage, if you do on-field her, and typically this would be something like a Lauma plus Ino Hyper Bloom team, you can also further improve Lauma's damage, especially with Ascendant Gleam, if you on-field her with the 4-piece Night of the Skies Unveiling. For Lauma's energy recharge, For most situations, I would say around 160% to upwards of 180% in a double Dendro situation where she is predominantly off-field. 160% tends to be enough for most situations from what I've seen. And if you on-field Lauma, that can be as low as 130% energy recharge. However, if Lauma is the only Dendro character and she's off-field, this can be upwards of 200% energy recharge, so yeah, do keep that in mind. As always, energy recharge is a huge moving target, so you'll definitely want to experiment to see what works for you. For Lauma's substats, it's fairly unlamarkable. She benefits the most from Elemental Mastery substat rolls since, well, those boost everything important in her kit. Then we have energy recharge rolls, which are great until you hit however much energy recharge that you need. Then we have crit rate rolls, which are generally a bit more preferred than crit damage rolls, especially if you're not on the Night of the Skies Unveiling with Ascendant Gleam. Then we have crit damage rolls, which are great too, as they further improve her Lunar-Bloom damage. And finally, attack percent and flat attack are pretty useless on her, so don't bother with those. Unfortunately, gearing Lauma with ideal artifacts will be quite challenging, as ideally you'll want Elemental Mastery, Energy Recharge, and double crit, but generally speaking, getting 2 to 3 of these substats is fine for the sub DPS / support character that she is. We made it to Lauma's weapons, and I'm going to try to keep this short, even though it can be really, really long because of all the yapping that is possible due to Lauma. I mean, I could just lambast you guys with all the Lauma stuff, but you know, I'm going to spare you guys from that, which is why I'm still yapping for some reason. Anyway, starting off, her signature catalyst is overall unsurprisingly her best option, even factoring in, for example, needing more energy recharge for this thing in comparison to some of the other options. And this will be the baseline for both Lauma's damage as well as Lauma's team's damage ratio. Now, Lauma's damage here is interesting because this number here actually signifies the damage, of course, that Lauma herself does, but also the flat damage added through Lauma's elemental burst, and finally, the additional damage added to the team thanks to, for example, the weapon's passive. In this case, the Night Weaver's Looking Glass adds a bunch of Bloom type damage as well as, well, I guess Lunar-Bloom damage, which only affects her direct damage. But I've included the Bloom's damage increase because it's effectively almost just like a flat damage increase in a way, working similarly, but not exactly, but pretty similarly to the flat Bloom damage boosts that her elemental burst provides. So this number here that we can see for Lauma's damage includes the bonus Bloom damage of her signature weapon. With all that yapping out of the way, needless to say, this will also boost future Lunar-Bloom DPS characters by a bit. It's not a tremendous amount, but it's going to be, you know, noticeable. So this weapon does have that going for it. Anyway, up next we have the 1,000 Floating Dreams, and this is also a very solid option for her, providing 40 elemental mastery to the team as well as improving Lauma's personal damage by a bit. And one thing about this weapon is that if, for example, you are using her with Nahida, you should probably just use this on Nahida regardless, and instead you can slap on something else on Lauma. And it is worth noting that if you don't, if, for example, future teams with Lunar-Bloom don't incorporate Nahida in them, which they might not, honestly, I have no idea, then you could just slap this on Lauma in the future instead. So the next weapon, we just have a couple Elemental Mastery stat sticks. Lauma likes her Elemental Mastery, and these just provide a bunch of elemental mastery. Then we have the Aetherlight Spindle Loot, which, as you can see, is only about 10% worse than her signature weapon, and this one provides a lot of energy recharge, which of course you can allocate the energy recharge stats, substat rolls, into other stats if possible. So a great option for her, and this will be the event weapon, I believe, in 6.0. After that, we have the free-to-play friendly craftable weapon, the Black Marrow Lantern. And I will say the Black Marrow Lantern will be better than the Aetherlight Spindle Loot in 2 scenarios. One being where energy is not really an issue and you have Lauma's burst whenever you need it. Then this weapon will just do more damage. Of course, you know, you're going to need a few more energy recharge rolls most likely, but let's say, you know, you are over energy recharge on the Aetherlight, and the Black Marrow Lantern, assuming you can still get enough ER, is going to be better. Also, this weapon will improve a little bit with Ascendant Gleam. We have some other options, including the Wandering Evenstar, providing roughly, I would say, you know, somewhere between 90 and 180 attack to her teammates. And the issue with the attack buff that she provides is that most of the teams she's on, the attack buff isn't going to do much. Like for example, on this Nilo-Bloom team, it basically does almost nothing, the attack buff, as you can see. But still a pretty decent weapon, all things considered, especially for teams where they might value attack a little bit more. Then up next, we have the Sacrificial Fragments. This one is really interesting, and I thought it might be a little bit better, and this is very, very theoretical because it really changes your rotation a lot. But basically, for the first couple rotations, you're going to get a couple more noticeable blooms, and you'll speed up a few, but basically, you are pigeonholed by the Sacrificial Fragment's 16-second cooldown versus her skill's natural 12-second cooldown, and after a few additional extra E's, which is also RNG dependent based on whether or not Sacrificial Fragments activates or not, then yeah, it's a bit messy. So that's why I tend to not lean towards recommending the Sacrificial Fragments over the above options. But as you can see, even assuming you don't take advantage of her hold E reduced cooldown by much, even then, you know, it still performs roughly the same as these other weapons in terms of the overall team damage ratio. Then we have the prototype Amber, which is an interesting one because this can provide healing for your team as well as, you know, helps Lauma with her own energy recharge requirements. This can be useful if, for example, you just need a healer and you don't have any other healer. Lauma can definitely step in to take, you know, that role for to a reasonable degree. Typically, I would recommend putting this on perhaps a different character if you have another Catalyst character instead of Lauma, but a usable option nonetheless. And after that, we have some other options which you can take a look at the list. There's only two more notable ones, I would say, being the Favonius Codex. Do recommend, you know, crit rate if you do use this thing, but maybe for Stygian Onslaught, if you really need to bring up their burst quicker, you can use this, but overall I recommend running Favonius on the other characters over Lauma. And you can even use the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers. This is pretty much just for, honestly, Kanish. And I can't really think of any other teams where you'd want to use the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers, but yeah, there's one good team for her to use the Thrilling Tales on. We've made it to Lauma's investment priority and constellations, and I will also briefly talk about Nahida as well as Nilo and the other Dendro characters from Sumeru that are being run concurrently with Lauma. Starting off, Lauma's signature weapon is not needed. It does provide a nice around 10%-ish bonus damage to the overall team damage output for most Bloom teams, but as you can see, it is generally nowhere near a necessity for Lauma. Lauma's Constellation 1 is actually pretty interesting because it provides the on-field character with a significant amount of healing, I believe around 6,000-ish every other second or so. This does look pretty solid, and it's great role consolidation and quality of life. It also improves her deer form for exploration purposes. But in my opinion, of course, you don't need her Constellation 1 at all, and the current healers do just fine. But this might allow for you to slot in different, more damage-oriented teammates in the future. Lauma's Constellation 2 is great because it basically doubles the effect of her elemental burst, resulting in roughly a 14% gain in overall damage output for example, a Nilo-Bloom team. Then Lauma's Constellation 3 adds another 3 levels to her burst, which is nice. Constellation 4 gives her a decent amount of energy, which helps her ramp up time for Stygian Onslaught and allows for you to build her with a lot less energy recharge. Constellation 5 adds 3 levels to her skill, which gives her 9% more Hydro and Dendro Shred. And those are really just stepping stones for Constellation 6, which just makes her do a ton of Lunar-Bloom damage if you want to on-field her. And most likely, Lauma won't be an on-field DPS even at Constellation 6 for whales once the actual Lunar-Bloom DPS character rolls around. So they added this new elevated multiplier, which appears to just be its own new multiplier for Lunar-Bloom damage. So this should help whatever future Lunar-Bloom damage character comes along. Now, that brings me to the investment priority. Personally, I think Lauma at Constellation 0 with free-to-play weapons is already a fantastic character, and if you really do want to get the extra juice out of her, you can go for her signature weapon as well as her Constellation 2, but overall, fantastic character at C0 with free-to-play options. And then I want to talk about Nahida and Nilo as well as the Sumeru Chronicle Witch Banner. Personally, I just do not recommend pulling for any of them, and definitely not for their constellations either. As we can see through Lauma, she's basically power creeping Constellation 2 Nahida and Constellation 2 Nilo, which is honestly pretty insane. And that one extra 5-star character pull that you are investing into could be put towards, for example, Nefer, who might be a Lunar-Bloom DPS character, or it could be put towards, you know, someone else that could help your account much more than one of these older Sumeru characters. So yeah, unfortunately, unless you just really like these characters like Nahida and Nilo, I unfortunately cannot recommend pulling from them due to recent power creep. And also Constellation Zero Lauma with free-to-play friendly options will cleanly deal with all the current Bloom related content, which further disincentivizes you from, well, wasting your money on older Sumeru characters. Alright, we've made it to Lauma's remarkable teams, starting with this free-to-play friendly Hyper Bloom team. And if you can't tell, I am pretty tired. These guide videos lately have been really taxing because there's just so much to talk about. We've got like what? Almost the original number of Pokemon in terms of characters. With this first one being Hyper Bloom, one of my personal favorite archetypes for Lauma. You can just on-field her. She does some decent spread damage with Kuki, Xingqiu, and Kalei. Alternatively, with a character like Aino, you get a few more Dendro core production, although sometimes Kuki can't keep up with it, sometimes she can. And sometimes you will also lose the Dendro aura, but you also get 15% crit rate on the whatchamacallit Night set. Needless to say, this is a very flexible team when it comes to team building. You can swap out Dendros like Nahida, Baizul. You can even do something like this with Raiden for Hyper Bloom as well as Baizul for the healer, so all sorts of different combinations for you. Xingqiu definitely a great character though because of the amount of Hydro he applies for Hyper Bloom. Now up next we have Burgeon. Not much else to say about this team besides this is Burgeon, Toma really being the main viable Burgeon character. And yeah, we can move on to Nilo teams, and Nilo team variants are going to be pretty interesting as well as pretty powerful as of Lauma's release. And fortunately, you can of course swap around various characters. Let's say you don't have Kokomi. You can of course use Barbara more so as the on-field Hydro applier as well as healer for the team. And instead of Nahida, you can pretty much use most Dendro characters like Baizul. Yao Yao works well here. And heck, even Tignari as well, because why the heck not? But my personal favorite variation of this Lunar-Bloom team is probably something like this. Up next, we have more of a spread support for Alhaitham. And what's really cool about Lauma supporting spread DPSs like Alhaitham or Tignari is that if, for example, you run Aino right here, you can also run the Night set on Alhaitham, which is a pretty decent artifact set, especially considering you'll be farming for both the Knights as well as the Silken Songs at the same time, basically killing two birds with one stone in a single domain. Alternatively, you can do a setup like this with a Nefa instead to trigger the Hyper Blooms as well. And needless to say, of course, you can do this with a Quick Bloom style DPS like Clorond or Sino or Kaching, as well as various other Electro and Hydro characters will work out just great with Lauma here. Then we have this more hipster team with a Thrilling Tales Deepwood Lauma, pretty much just passing on this buff to Kanish. So that way, Kanish will just do a lot of damage. You can replace Yansan with, for example, Mavuika, or whatever you'd like for this final slot, pretty much. Maybe not a Hydro character. Or then Lauma also makes a very solid support for Neuvillette thanks to her Hydro Shred. You can run something like Nefa plus Lauma in this team, and you won't be doing as many Hyper Blooms per se with this team, but Nefa will be doing a lot of damage herself, making this a very, very solid team for Neuvillette. And yeah, that covers most of the archetypes for Lauma team building. Fortunately, not too bad because she is more pigeonholed into the Dendro playstyle, unsurprisingly being a Dendro character. Alright, we've made it to one quick showcase as well as just me yapping a bit. This is a Lauma free-to-play friendly Hyper Bloom team, and what's cool about this run is that this was one of the earlier runs that I did with this team against the crab, so didn't really have much practice against it. But Hyper Bloom isn't great against these silly mushrooms, to be completely honest, because yeah, the mushrooms are weird like that. But anyway, enough yapping about mushrooms. Basically, Lauma, I mean, look, she's basically modern Dendro power creep. Natlin power creep doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon. And yeah, I mean, Lauma just does it all. She's completely cracked. Basically, two Constellation 2 characters and Nilo's Constellation 2 as well as Nahida's built into her base kit. So incredibly, incredibly powerful character, and we can kind of expect this trend moving forward in Genshin Impact. So that's also why I was talking about, not really recommending to pull any of the older Sumeru characters unless you just really like them, or you need some bodies for Imaginarium Theater. Those are pretty expensive bodies, but hey, sometimes bodies are just a little bit pricier than 4-star bodies. But yeah, as you can see, crab, any bloom content, if you can't really clear it with Lauma, then the content is probably poorly designed, because Lauma just takes bloom to the next level. And do I recommend her? I personally, you know, if you care about meta, I think she's going to be a fantastic character. Very, very powerful, as we can see. And just really, you know, she's really blooming Bloom to the next level. And we can probably expect similar levels of power with future Nod-Krai characters. And we're just going to have to wait and see what her final team ends up looking like and how powerful it might be in the future. As always, I appreciate every single one of you. This is I Want to Lose, signing out.